Hello friends. For today's video, I wanted to go through some of my favorite fantasy books that I've picked up over the last few years. So I've done a few different videos where I talk about favorites, either favorite standalones, favorite completed series, and this is going to be kind of an oddball mix of books where some of them are standalones, some of them are new releases and they're the first in the series and we have yet to get their sequels. Some of them are fourth books in series or third books in series, the completion of a trilogy, something like that. So it's just kind of an odd mix, but all of these really stood out to me for various different reasons, and so I just kind of wanted to go through and highlight them. These are not necessarily my favorites of all time. I'm very, very particular about my favorites of all time. It's really hard to break up into that list, but these are ones that I greatly, greatly enjoy, and for me, all of these were 5-star reads. So I'm going to start with one that if you keep up with new releases or if you watch a fair amount of my videos, you've probably seen me talk about this one a lot this year, and that would be Godkiller. This book was so good. It really took me by surprise. I already thought the synopsis sounded really, really interesting and different and captivating, but I really didn't know just how good it was going to be. And it's really shockingly short for how much of a story you get within this amount of time. I have compared this before to Witcher, basically by saying if you like Witcher, or if you like Witcher but wish there was just more Geralt-Ciri interactions, then pick this up, because that's definitely what it feels like. You follow this society where there are so many different gods, some of which have a very small amount of power, some of which are incredibly powerful, but what's left of the gods, they are at odds with human beings. And there are individuals known as Vega who hunt the remaining gods, because the gods can compel people through manipulation and the desire for humans to worship. They can become more powerful, but they can convince human beings to do very terrible things. And so this is why we have the Vegas in place. However, as a result of some people still desiring this faith and this worship to gods, you have some people that hate Vegas. And so there is that element to it. There's almost like a monster hunter who's mistreated by society, similar to Witcher. But then you have a little girl who is very privileged and she's been very sheltered, and for some reason, unknown to anyone, she has a bond with a god, and this should never occur, and she cannot separate herself from this god without potentially harming herself and maybe even dying. And same goes for that god. So the both of them, while they really care about each other, this god and this little girl, they want to be able to live their own lives, and so she seeks out this Vega to see if maybe the Vega can help her remove this dangerous bond. And then that sets our characters up on their quest, if you will. And I just thought that the history within the story, the opening was so interesting. Everything about it, I just was really sucked into, and I basically couldn't put it down. When I started it, I was like, I need to know what happens next. So highly recommend Godkiller. It is the first in a series, so you're gonna have to wait for a sequel. But for me, it's I'm sure the sequel will be worth the wait. It was worth it to start it and just get that amount of story, because sometimes you don't want to start a series because you're like, well, I want the next one. But with this one, even though I want the next one, I'm like, I'm so glad that I read that. Next up, we have the book Kaikeyi. This is a standalone and is very drastically different from Godkiller. This is going over a large period of time. We're following this character from the time that she is a young girl into being an adult. And we are seeing the way that so much of her life and her freedoms and her aspirations have somewhat been stripped of her, and how she tries to find agency within the amount of power that she has. And she's a really formidable person, but she has these restrictions in place as a result of her society. And one of the themes in the story that I think so many people will connect with is, to put it very generally, the wanting of a better society and wanting to progress while also still valuing the old and valuing tradition and the wisdom of the people that are older than you, that are your parents or your grandparents, or just figures in your life who are elders. And how do you have those two things not clash, and how sometimes inevitably they're going to clash if you do fight for what you believe in, if you fight for this progress over here. So it is a generational thing. It's a thing that has to do with sometimes faith. It's a thing that has to do with tradition and culture. And so I think that our main character is struggling with that, and she cares so much for so many different things, but then wants for a certain society. She wants for progress, and I really enjoyed the way that the author tackled that. I think she did it with a lot of nuance, and I thought that this main character was somebody who I really, really loved seeing her progress throughout the story. I really loved seeing her arc. After that, a character whose arc maybe you almost don't love, but you can't look away, and we have She Who Became the Sun. I think this one's a little bit harder to get into. It has a little bit less, not that all of these have mass appeal necessarily, but I think this one's a little bit more difficult to get into because of how the story is delivered to you. When it first starts, you're following primarily one character, and you're seeing the way in which they're going from somebody who is kind of on the bottom of society, and they're climbing and clawing their way up. And then at some point in the story, after a certain amount of time has passed, you get to a new section of the book where you start having to take in all of the history and the politics of all these different groups and all these different characters. And it's such a tonal shift to some degree, but also your attention, you have to pull everything in, and you have to look in so many different places. And I think that can pull a lot of people out of the story. It's also very military heavy, very political. And I know that's not everybody's cup of tea, but I was thoroughly engaged, and I was very fascinated watching the descent of these characters, because these are some very morally gray characters that makes them horrible. Not even morally gray. They get to a point where you're like, you're just not a good person. And that's, for me, actually difficult, because at some point when some characters start going way too off the deep end, I'm like, I really don't like you. I don't know if I want to keep following. But when you can write that character that, like I said, you're like, I can't look away. I have to watch. That's what this book did, I thought, very, very well. So where Kaikeyi, her arc was so moving and powerful, and I just felt so strongly for her. In this, I'm like, I don't really, you're not such a good person, but it's still entertaining to watch. After that, this is the third and final book in one of my favorite trilogies of all time. This conclusion, ironically, is actually not my favorite in the trilogy. My favorite in the trilogy is Flamefall, but Furysong was phenomenal. The reason that Flamefall beats it for me is just because of some of the themes that are touched on in that one. It just really are ones that I find so interesting, and I never really get tired of some of them. In this one, it is the conclusion, so I think there's a part of me that's like, I don't want it to end. And that's hits pretty hard as well. But the characters in this story, the themes in this story, the way in which we're examining political structures. If you don't know, I've talked about it many a time, but Fireborn, the first book, the Aurelian Cycle, follows a society that has gone through a revolution, and you're looking at somebody whose family previously were of the ruling class, and then you're looking at another character who was at the bottom, and her family was actually killed by the other character's family before the revolution happened. The revolution happened, and of course this other character, his name was Lee, his family was killed. He saw so many people die horrifically during this revolution, and he was a boy. He loved his family. He cared about them. He didn't really understand fully, he didn't fully grasp what atrocities they committed. But as he grows up, he starts to actually really believe in the principles of this new form of government, but he has to reconcile that with the horrors that he witnessed as a child. And there are some things that were taught to him when he was young, and so he has a lot of very difficult feelings. And he can see in his best friend, Annie, who he met in the orphanage that he ended up in, he can see the way that his family ruined her life, and he can see the way they took everything from her. And she has some suspicions about his previous life. Nobody knows that he was the son of these very important individuals. And so you're looking at these young people who now both, despite their differences in the previous form of government, in this new form of government, they both have equal opportunity to excel. And I'm doing this because it's perhaps not as equal as it seems, and that's explored brilliantly in this trilogy. There are also dragons, and then you look at how equal can everybody be if some people have dragons. And it's done exceptionally. It's so fantastic, and this third book had some of the most hard-hitting, I just want to cry my eyes out type of scenes. There's one in particular that every time I think about it, I'm like, What are you doing to me? It's so good. And this conclusion I thought was brilliant. It was fantastic. Speaking of conclusions, this is not a brand new release, but it was very good. And I also, when I finished this, I was like, why? Why did it have to go that way? But in a good way. Now it'd be the Poison Song. This is the third and final book in the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams. And I love this trilogy. So many of you, I'm sure, know that. It is so unique. It's so different. And I have said many a time that the synopsis is bonkers and it's unlike anything probably you've really read before. You have these individuals who are near immortals because of the fact they feed off of the sap of this giant magical tree. However, one day that tree starts to die, its sap is no longer available, and this race of people known as Eborans start trying to gain their near immortality by feeding off of the blood of humans, which causes all of these wars, and then it also causes something called the Crimson Flux, which is this illness that is starting to wipe out all of the Eborans, which typically human beings would be fine with. However, it does result in this race dying out and all the secrets that their long lives led them to hold. And these secrets are important because they have all the answers to an unknown threat that will return. And people know it will likely return. They just don't know when. They don't know how. They don't even know what it is. And they especially don't know now that all of the Eborans are dying out. That's the setup for the trilogy. There's so much more to it than that. Our characters are witty and obnoxious and endearing, and it's really fun to watch these characters bicker and banter and maybe come together and have such great moments throughout the trilogy. This third one in particular is the weirdest. They're all weird, but this third one is so weird, but I was really into it. I dug it. The antagonists are kind of really not really like anything else I've read, but you're like, what the heck? And I just, it's so bizarre, and I really, really love it. I love it so much, and it's sad and bleak, but hopeful at the same time. The combat, the fighting scenes are great because you have some that are more intimate, close, and then you have ones that are really epic in scope, and then you have some that are aerial, and you have some on the ground, and there's cool different weapons and magic, and it's great. Epic fantasy at its finest, I always say. Witch's Heart is the next one on this list. This is the most of all the ones I've talked about, like Kaikeyi, in its tone, in its writing style, in the amount of time that passes, and we follow this woman who is the mother of monsters. She is Loki's witch wife. Her name is Angrboda, and she lives in isolation, basically, and the only person she has much contact with primarily is Loki. And she likes her somewhat isolated life. She really enjoys just keeping to herself and having these occasional visits. What she doesn't want is to attract the attention of the other gods, because she knows that they will try to use some of her powers for their own gain, and she is trying to keep them from being able to do that. And the lengths at which she will go to keep that, to have this relative privacy and isolation, are put to the test when she starts to have children who she loves very much. And this story, in a lot of ways, is a story of sacrifice. It's a story of motherhood, of parenthood in general. Very different. We have Rhythm of War. This is kind of what I said about Winnowing Flame. It's epic fantasy at its finest. There's so many themes. I know so many of you know this because you're also big Sanderson fans, or you've heard of Sanderson, that there's so much to this story that really dives into mental health, that really examines the effects of trauma. It really shows the way in which some of us, the way that the things that we've endured, what choices are we going to make, and how, while the things that impact our life, how do we let those define us? And it shows good versus evil in a way that I think is much more nuanced. It's not your classic good versus evil, but you get varying degrees of that. You have at the very, very bottom, you have like the worst of the worst. And at the top, you have like the most heroic of heroes. But do you actually? And you kind of zero in and get to focus on a lot of those characters and these beings, I'll say, that in a lot of stories, it is just ultimate evil, or it is just that's the bad guy. So it's really well fleshed out, I think. It helps that they're all really long, so we have the time to do that. But while some of the other stories, I think that the themes are a little bit stronger or more at the forefront, what I think is the exceptional thing about Stormlight Archive is the creativity. I mean, there's so many things about it that's great. It's not like the number one best thing ever, but the creativity in the Stormlight Archive is phenomenal, whether we're talking about the magic or we're talking about the world itself, the architecture as a result of the weather and the flora and the fauna, and all of that is just, there's not really a whole lot like it. Stormlight Archive is kind of sci fantasy and epic fantasy, and it's phenomenal. I love it so much, and Rhythm of War was very emotional. It was a nice sort of return in a sense, because the third book gets so big, and then this fourth one is kind of, we're getting more answers and we're getting more personal struggles. It feels like, once again, because we start that way in Way of Kings, we kind of maintain that, but we're getting bigger. Oathbringer is massive, and then we focus back in, but then we also leave some things make you on the edge of your seat, like, oh my gosh, I need book 5 right now. So there's still some things unanswered, and there's still some things where you're like, oh my gosh, are we gonna make it? And I love that about Rhythm of War. Last, we have one that, it's not, in my opinion, the absolute best series conclusion I've ever read, but I did really like how it wrapped everything up. I can't wait to read what this author does next, which she has something lined up, so it won't be all that long before we get to see what she does next, and that would be The Bone Shard War. I loved this trilogy. I've loved this trilogy since I picked up the first book. This third book did not disappoint, although for a long time it took me a while to get into, and I think people are going to have mixed thoughts on this. I did do a video recently talking more in depth, and then I've also done a discussion video over on Patreon with a couple of my friends, so if you're interested in seeing that, I'll have it linked. But regardless, this world has just been one that I fell in love with. It is the area that we focus in on, all things considered, is kind of small, so I almost would consider this more high fantasy as opposed to epic fantasy, but the world, the way in which the seas affect these islands, the politics, the natural disasters that occur, I mean, it still feels very epic because it feels like so many things are really well thought out, and you can explore those different things through our different characters, because you have some of them that are navigating trade and policy and politics, and then you have some that are trying to rule over everybody, and they just are always coming short because one person just can never handle all of that, and then you have another character who's exploring, and so they're traveling through these different places, but as somebody who isn't a necessarily important political figure necessarily, so you're getting to see the world through so many different characters, and all the pieces kind of come together to complete this whole. I thought the world building was very well done. The first book, though, it's a blend of different genres. I always say it's a very genre-bending story, and the magic is so cool, and you're trying to piece together what the heck is even happening in that first book. The characters, though, are so great, and of course, and Rhythm of War has this too, and actually, Winnowing Flame, the animal companion element to it. I suppose, technically, Fireborn has the dragons, but they're not as connected as the animal companion, mythological creature companion that you get in this series, as the companions, we'll call them, the Spren, that you get in Stormlight Archive. Lots of great companion elements to this. Like I said, the magic is just so cool. The way in which the genres blend together is great, especially in that first book. And really, truly, I'm like, I want that next story that she's writing. Another thing to note about all of these is that every single one of these books, I think, shows so many different sides of different kinds of characters. I mentioned in Stormlight Archive, you're looking at a lot of mental health representation, which is fantastic. In a lot of these, you're looking at characters who have gone through a tremendous amount of trauma, and you're focusing on their healing. You're looking at different characters that are parents. You're looking at motherhood, like I said before. And another element you're looking at is that every single one of these books actually has main characters that are queer. You have LGBTQ characters in every single one of these, and all of those characters have their own perspectives. And to me, I just think that is probably part of why just seeing all these different stories with all these different kinds of characters and all these different kinds of things, it really fleshes out characters. It makes them feel like real people. And I'm such a character-driven reader that I get a little frustrated, and I think a lot of us do, when it feels like a story is put out and that single aspect of a person, whatever that may be, whether it's the fact that they're a parent, whether it's the fact that they have a certain mental health struggle, or whether it's the fact that they're LGBTQ, it sometimes can feel like publishing takes a certain part of a person, and that is all they focus on and that is all they market. And people are complex and people are unique, and sometimes we want to see certain characters as heroes, and sometimes we want to see them as villains, and sometimes we wanted to see them as a average old person that's just going about life trying their best. And all of these books, I think, have such a great mix of all of those different kinds of characters, all these fantastic different kinds of stories. So I really appreciate getting to have that in my books. I think all of these are so different from one another, and I really love all the different characters that we examine in all of these, whether they are like what we see in She Who Became the Sun, where I'm like, I don't know if you're really not a good person. Whether it's that, or you have, in Storm My Archive, it's like so heroic, and you just have everything in between all of these different stories. So these are some of my favorites, and I can't wait to see what else these authors do. If they have more books out, I can't wait to pick up more books that they've written. Oh, I mentioned how we have more from the Drowning Empire coming out, but Jen Williams has another series coming out also, and I can't wait. And the sequel to She Who Became the Sun comes out soon, so there's just so much to be excited about with all of these. Let me know what some of your random favorite fantasy books are, whether they're standalones, random sequels, conclusions, first books in series. I would love to know. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely, lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.